Hi guys, I'm here with another video comparing one culture's sword to another. In this particular case, the military saber versus the Japanese katana. You'll see it in our sparring clips. At this particular time, we've only got one of them up, and the saber does exceptionally well against the katana. Now, some people have read a little bit too much into that. Of course, you've got to consider the quality of the fighters. And I have mentioned in the video that the person using the saber in that particular incident is the instructor of the student. So obviously there's a bit of an advantage there, and fights aren't always fair. But I can give you a much better overview of how they actually compare to one another with this kind of article. So first of all, we need to look at the context. Did they actually face one another? Well, I've not seen any exact information to say yes either way myself yet. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. They existed alongside each other. The sabre, as we see here, British sabre, came into use in the late 18th century and lasted through to the late 19th century. The katana was obviously well in use until its ban and reintroduction later on. So they lived alongside one another, certainly, and if you actually look to the late 19th century, the Japanese actually did start using sabres themselves. And this is as it looks. It is a katana blade, but shortened to one hand with a European-inspired sabre hilt on it, and it's a military pattern sword they made in great numbers. So the Japanese did actually adopt them themselves, and you will see a time period where the Japanese were actually in military service using both katana style swords and European inspired sabres. And I'm sure they did actually put them up against one another more than once. So that'll be interesting to see if we can find some evidence of that. As ever with individual accounts, it's hard to tell exactly what swords are being used, so it's very hard to tell how they fared against one another. So we're just going to have to compare them like for like, see how they do, and I'll give you my personal opinion on them. So looking at specifications, the katana I've got here, this reproduction, it's a 27-inch blade. You're talking averaging about 27 to 29 inch for a katana, and a military sabre, you're talking in the realms of 31 up to about 33 inches. So as a one-handed sword, you've obviously got a slight advantage in blade length over most equivalent katanas, something in the region of 2 to 4, 5 inches, something like that. So there is a reach advantage in blade. And in terms of weight, this sabre, which is British infantry officer sabre, 1803 pattern, weighs 800 grams, which is perhaps just below the average weight of a katana. And if you compare a later period, the sort of Gothic hilts you see going through the 19th century, they come out near enough the same weight, about 8 to 850 grams. So the military sabres are often going to be in the same range as the actual katanas, but obviously one is a one-handed sword and one is a predominantly two-handed sword. In terms of how good they are at cutting, now obviously the katana is known as an exceptionally good cutting sword, and sabres can vary quite a bit. This particular sword, the 1803 flank officer's sword, or infantry officer's sword, is based on a cavalry sword, the 1796, which was known to be one of the best cutters of its time, an exceptionally good cutting sword. And this is the same blade, just made a fraction lighter for infantry use. So they are exceptionally good cutters. And when we go to a later period, Gothic hilted sword, it gets much straighter, slightly better on thrust work, not necessarily quite as good on the cut as the more curved blades. So you're going to see quite a bit of variation. But there's no doubt that sabres on the whole, and actually as you imagine a curved sabre, which is the general definition, they are very good cutting swords. Do they develop exactly the same kind of cutting power as the katana? Well, that's going to be an interesting one to investigate, although I'd certainly say if you talk to any Polish people, they would say they definitely do. The cutting power of a sabre can be immense. So I would say both swords exceptionally good cutters. In terms of point work, well, as I said, that's going to vary on the individual sabre. The 1803 flank officer's sword, it can thrust. It's not a great thrusting tip compared to some of the later period stuff in much the same way as a katana is, but it can still thrust perfectly well. So that's sort of comparing the cut and thrust of the two swords. Now looking at the protection offered. The military sabres, they all tend to have some kind of hand protection, whether it's just a knuckle bow and some bars, which is, you know, basically the same protection as a katana on top, but with a nice knuckle bow for protection. This can make a hell of a difference in a fight. And you'll see a little bit more protection again as the swords go on. So a little bit of extra hand protection on these sabres. The big difference, I would say, between these two swords, and this is really highlighted in the sparring footage, is the dexterity or agility of the two swords. Is that the katana is known as to be a very fast sword, and it is a very fast sword, but with any two-handed grip, whether you want to use it one or two-handed, you will have some restriction in movement, and that's just the human anatomy for you. Is look, the whole rotation of the wrist is if there's anything down here to get in the way, it both gets in the way and also alters the rotational point of the sword. So if you get a sabre, such as this, that has a nice short grip and no restriction whatsoever in terms of rotation, it can move in ways that a two-handed sword can't, as I said, whether it's used one or two-handed. So that's when you see these really fast rotations going around that are often cut into the arms that are going to be faster with a sabre than they can be with a katana. However, obviously with a two-handed grip, you're afforded a leverage that you don't get with a one-handed sword. So if you, for example, stand in guard with a sabre and just reach forward and cut, that's a very poor cutting technique. And yet with a two-handed sword, you can reach forward and use leverage to actually draw the cut through and actually do a good cut. So in terms of these quick snapping cuts, the katana is going to be much faster. But in terms of rotational cuts, the sabre has an advantage. Now on to blunt force trauma. You're not typically going to find much difference between the two. As again, if you use these rotations with the sabre, they develop massive power to the same degree as a two-handed cut will. So you're not going to find an awful lot of difference between the two. And in terms of edge sharpness, the katana has typically a sharper edge because it's harder. The European swords can be sharpened to a similar degree, but they will blunt a little bit quicker, and they frequently weren't sharpened to quite that degree, just because obviously the Japanese, they really favour it sharpening to very, very sharp edges. However, there's obviously a little bit more to an actual strike than just the slice. Right, on to durability. That's an interesting one. The sabres varied immensely. Now a sword like this is very durable. They were known to be. The flank officers' swords, based on the light calves, they were very, very tough, very durable blades. And when we get to these kind of Gothic hilted swords, there was some controversy over poor quality blades breaking and bending, but most of that has actually been put down to actually poor maintenance and things like that. So what I would say is these kind of sabres, they tend to be very tough in combat. Now, is one going to break the other when it strikes one another? Well, not likely, unless your technique is really poor. Age-old issue of where are you striking and where are you parrying. So no, durability, they're going to roughly compare. That's sort of just comparing the two swords overall. Now, what do I think about how it works in a fight? Whereas with the other swords, the long sword and the rapier, I've said there's sort of advantages and disadvantages, but they come out perhaps similar in many ways. The sabre, I would say, has a big advantage in many regards. Again, if you start in a scenario that is unarmoured and with swords drawn, the rotational cuts of the sabre allow you to strike at different angles with massive speed that we've seen to be a huge advantage with the katana, against the katana, and for that matter against a longsword. So what would I choose? I would choose a sabre. I've seen them to be incredibly effective at striking hands and arms, which would disable an opponent using a two-handed sword very easily. Saying that, the katana obviously it still has massive cutting power. It's still got a very quick draw. It's still going to be very good in confined spaces where you can't get, say, the rotations with the sabre. So it's not all sort of which sword is perfect or which one is better, but if you gave me an open fight scenario, open ground, unarmoured, then yes, I would favour the sabre. So that's all on this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and please subscribe if you haven't already.